I won't let my moderate to severe plaque psoriasis symptoms define me.
Emerge as you. In 2 clinical studies, Tremfya guselkumab, taken by injection, provided 90% clearer skin at 16 weeks in 7 out of 10 adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. In a study, nearly 7 out of 10 patients with 90% clearer skin at 16 weeks were still clearer at 5 years. At 1 year and thereafter, patients and healthcare providers knew that Tremfya was being used. This may have increased results. Results may vary.
Serious allergic reactions may occur. Tremfya may increase your risk of infections and lower your ability to fight them. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms of infection, including fever, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough. Tell your doctor if you had a vaccine or plan to.
Emerge as you. Learn more about Tremfya, including important safety information at tremfya.com or call 1-877-578-3527. See our ad in Food and Wine magazine. For patients prescribed Tremfya, cost support may be available.
Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. See ebaymotors.com.
The Angie's List you know and trust is now Angie, and we're so much more than just a list. We still connect you with top local pros and show you ratings and reviews, but now we also let you compare upfront prices on hundreds of projects and book a service instantly. We can even handle the rest of your project from start to finish. So remember, Angie's List is now Angie, and we're here to get your job done right. Get started at Angie.com. That's ANGI, or download the app today.
Last year, they went and took it.
He struck him out looking.
This year,
the Texas Rangers win the World Series.
They're here to run it back.
It's over.
This is Believe in Texas Rangers, hosted by Mitch Ferreldis.
A World Series rematch in the making. Welcome into this episode of Believe in Texas Rangers. This is a very unique opportunity for this particular series because it's very early on in the season that we have the World Series rematch from 2023. And because of that, instead of just doing recapping of what happened with the Minnesota Twins series, which the Rangers were able to salvage the series by getting a victory today, ending their multi-game skid, that was good. But now they get to come back home and they're welcoming in the Arizona Diamondbacks. So for today's episode, it's going to be more of how it's been, what has changed between these two teams since they last met. And to bring in some insight on the Arizona Diamondbacks, we welcome in Steve Zinsmeister, who works on the radio broadcast team for the Diamondbacks. And more importantly, someone that I spent a lot of time with during the 2023 World Series. Steve, thanks for taking some time today, man. Really appreciate it.
Hello, Mitchell. It's nice to see you as well. I'm happy to be joining you here and talking a little bit of baseball. It's been a crazy 2 months or so for the Diamondbacks. I imagine more or less the same with the Texas Rangers. And these two teams are not, in my view, they're not similar to what they were back when we saw them in the World Series. So we can get into some of the specifics of that.
I was going to say, honestly, we can start right there because I'm looking at the standings as of today. Both these teams have completed for the day as we're taping this on this Sunday. Diamondbacks are 25-28 and fourth place in their division. And the Rangers at 25-29 are in second place in the division. Steve, these teams are separated by a half game and both of them below 500.
Yeah, and in some ways, I guess it's similar to where they would have been this time last year or middle of the season last year, where neither of these teams were considered heavy favorites to be in the World Series. So in that way, I guess we are kind of where we were in 2023. But when you consider that these two teams won their respective pennants and ended up going to the World Series, neither of them are what they were at that point at the end of October and into November. The Diamondbacks certainly have had their rash of injuries they've had to deal with. That was something that's kind of kept them back a little bit in the first 2 months of the season. They're not using it as an excuse, but let's be honest, it has impacted them quite a bit. And I think that they're still seeing a lot of young guys that are having to show growth. And despite having a World Series team last year and adding to it in free agency, which we all felt pretty good about, this is a squad that has relied on a lot of youngsters. Slade Ciccone was here. Tommy Henry was here. We saw Blake Walston this weekend. Blaze Alexander's in his rookie year. So despite adding some good veterans to the lineup, this team is a little bit different looking than it was when you last saw them in the World Series.
I do want to touch on the off seasons both of these teams had, but like as the teams stand right now, the record is almost identical. But even within that, like the micro analyzation of these teams, the rotations are beat down right now. I mean, Texas has 6 guys that could be in the rotation right now on the injured list. If I'm not mistaken, the Diamondbacks are dealing with a similar situation with some of their key rotation starters. You mentioned youth. The young guys for the Rangers, very much struggling to start the year. There was a lot of hype around a young kid named Wyatt Langford. He's currently working on a rehab assignment, but has not met the expectation that a lot of people believed. And Evan Carter hasn't been able to really follow up that strong postseason run that he had, and he's hitting just barely above 200 right now. So even just beyond the record, Steve, these teams are dealing with very similar problems at this point in the year.
Yeah, and for the Diamondbacks, I think the bigger injuries for them early on were the loss of Alek Thomas and Geraldo Perdomo, just because of how pivotal those positions are in your lineup and then also in the field, obviously. But I think that with the starting pitchers, while the Diamondbacks haven't had nearly as many injuries as the Rangers have in their starting rotation, they've had pivotal ones. And Merrill Kelly was widely considered, not just the number 2 in your rotation, but kind of the 1B to Zach Gallen's 1A. And then you add a guy like Eduardo Rodriguez, who just has such a great track record of stability. And then that's kind of ironic looking back now that he hasn't made his debut and we're, almost to the month of June. And
Right.
So when you consider those 2 guys being out, I've been saying this all along. I actually thought that the young guys filling in for them have done a pretty admirable job for the most part. Even a guy like Slade Ciccone, who just got sent down at the end of this past week, he was fantastic first time through the order. He might be the best pitcher in baseball the first time through a batting order. It's just that he got to that last opportunity. I want to call it a start. It was actually like an opener game in Los Angeles, and he gives up 6 runs in 1 inning. But to his credit, he rebounds and doesn't allow much of anything the rest of the way. And so you take that 1 inning away, Slade's been really a great asset to this squad. But then other guys like Walston today was fantastic in his first career major league start, 4 2/3 scoreless. You look at some of the other guys they've had. Brandon Pfaadt I know as good as Brandon Pfaadt was in the postseason, and he took major steps in the postseason, he's really carried that over to this regular season. I know his ERA is in the low 4s, right around 4. But when you look at like the pitch mix and how he's kind of realized that his 4-seam fastball was getting hit around and going for home runs too often, you look at what he throws now, he's throwing way less 4-seams and he's throwing a lot more sinkers and sweepers, things with movement, and coming to the realization that he doesn't necessarily have to strike a ton of guys out in order to get major league hitters out. And that's a huge piece of growth for Brandon Pfaadt, a guy who made his major league debut in Arlington, faced the Rangers in the World Series, and now we'll have to face them again in Arlington this season.
Yeah, too much connection with Pfaadt and the Rangers, it would appear, so early in his career. Transitioning to another pitcher in particular, as we focus on how these teams kind of spent their off seasons, dealing with similar situations too. We can briefly touch on the fact that the TV contracts with Diamond Sports Group have been very different from team to team, but there's a lot of teams impacted from it as a result. But one of the big moves that the Diamondbacks made this offseason that very much piqued the interest of Rangers fans was when, 3 days before the season, they signed Jordan Montgomery, a guy who was a key piece of the Rangers World Series run, and now seems to be performing at that same level for the Diamondbacks so far this year, right?
Yeah, it's been interesting with Monty. Obviously, he didn't really have much of a spring training. I mean, he didn't have any spring training at a major league facility. He was still working out the whole time and ramping up his pitch count to about 75 by the time he signed with the Diamondbacks. So in that way, he was prepared. But I think he said something even just yesterday in the clubhouse about how, he always took spring training for granted, and now he loves it because he realizes how much he missed it. But it was one of the more strange press conferences when he signed because, A, it was the worst kept secret in the world that he was in the building and that he was going to be joining the team, but they just wanted to kind of hold on to that until the press conference. And then he was sitting next to Scott Boras, who in a lot of ways you could have said that Boras didn't do the best job by getting him a long-term contract. And so it was a weird press conference. There wasn't a lot of interaction between those guys. And then obviously he ends up firing his agent and going with somebody else days later. But Jordan Montgomery, to your point, has been a real stability for this rotation at a time where they're missing some key pieces. Is he a lockdown, shutdown kind of guy who's going to strike out 6 or 7 a game? No, he's not. He's at this point in his career, he's probably good for 6, maybe 7 innings. In his last start, he got pulled after 77 pitches, but that was just because he had 9 hits against him. And while the ERA and some of those other numbers might not impress you, I think Rangers fans know that Jordan Montgomery is the kind of guy that you're throwing out there because you can leave him and he's going to get out of his own situations. He's a ground ball pitcher. He's a sinker baller, which is something that the Diamondbacks really love in this organization. And there's plenty of good examples of good sinkers in this clubhouse. And Jordan just goes about his business on the most professional scale. I mean, the other guys look to him and I think what they see early in his tenure with this club is he just goes about his business. There's no funny business with Jordan Montgomery. He's a great guy, and he loves to laugh and hang out with his teammates and talk with those guys. But I think the professionalism that he brings to the starting rotation is huge when you consider that they've had to rely on guys like Ryan Nelson and Tommy Henry and Slade Ciccone and some of the others that we talked about. Not that there's anything wrong with those guys. It's just most of them are in their first or second season.
And Monty, to his credit, you think back to when he was with the Yankees, and we're not getting deep into the statistics or anything like that, but he wasn't necessarily the blow you away pitcher, or we're really impressed with the type of pitcher that he's become since leaving the Yankees. Like after he got traded to St. Louis and just went on a run of quality start after quality start and really helped the Cardinals push into the postseason that year. And now it's been equivalent for Texas this past year, and we're starting to see kind of the pitcher that Jordan Montgomery, to your point, of a ground ball guy who really mixes those 2 off-speed pitches. This is the pitcher that he is, and it's actually really nice to see that even this late in his career, I mean, he's almost 30, this late in his career, he's become one of the better starters in the game.
Yeah, if not just one of the more reliable. And just knowing that you have that guy coming up in your starting rotation is a huge boost to this team. And I know that I've talked with Torey Lovullo quite a bit about, where is Jordan, in terms of how have you figured out that relationship? Because when you don't have a spring training and that player is new to the team, and then it took him 2, almost 3 weeks to ramp up and be ready for his first start on April 19th, I think it was, that's a lot of time that you miss just being around the person. And so, in my conversations with Torey, I've been asking him about not just the pitcher of Jordan Montgomery, but how are you getting to know like the vibe that you get from a guy when he comes off the mound? That's something that you have to pick up on as a manager. And knowing, is this guy at the end of his line? Is it time for me to pull him? That's a relationship that you build over the course of a series of starts. And I think that they're finally starting to get to that point where Torey feels really comfortable with Jordan and letting him go and giving him a leash that's a little bit longer than some of their other guys because of the track record that he's had, both with other teams like the Yankees, the Cardinals, and the Rangers, and then being a World Series guy last year.
He wasn't he was the piece de resistance of the Diamondbacks offseason, but it was a very aggressive offseason from what I recall, getting Jock Peterson and Randall Grichuk to fill out the DH spot. Additionally, adding Eduardo Rodriguez to a rotation that we'll touch on in a second when we relive the World Series. They definitely needed an extra starting pitcher just based off how things went for them in the World Series. And here they are now with maybe it is the most money that they've spent in an offseason and on an entire payroll. And I have to imagine the reception, at least from the fan base, is still very supportive of the measure that that organization took this offseason.
Oh, sure. Yeah. The fans are ecstatic about the fact that Ken Kendrick is devoted to, putting that money that he made in the postseason back into the team and trying to be competitive. And that's evident. That's something he talked about that day with that awkward press conference with Jordan Montgomery, about how, we estimate a certain ticket sales over the course of a year and we can put that back into the team. So yeah, that's a great thing. And I think when you look at the acquisitions from the offseason, yeah, Monty's been a big one. To be determined on Eduardo Rodriguez. Obviously, he's probably not coming back till at least mid to late June. I hate to put a time frame on it because the team hasn't, but that would just make sense to me. So we'll see with him. And we obviously know we have a good idea of what we're getting with Erod, but he is coming off of an injury that's shelved him for quite a while. So we'll see. We'll give him some leash there. I think the underrated acquisitions of the offseason are the designated hitter platoon that's really worked to their advantage. You mentioned Jock Peterson, who's been crushing right-handed pitching. And when he's in the lineup, it feels like it's a much stretched lineup. There's a lot more depth to it just by adding that one guy who's just a true professional hitter, kind of in the way that Jordan Montgomery is with pitching. I look at Jock similarly with hitting. He just gets it. He just understands the science of hitting better than most guys do. And then when you throw in the splits, because really the designated hitter position is two guys, it's him and Randall Grichuk, who's hitting lefties at the clip that they hoped he would. And so, when you combine the two, the designated hitter position is probably their third best position outside of second base with Ketel Marte and first base with Christian Walker. And then a really, really under the radar acquisition in the offseason that nobody talked about is Kevin Newman, who wasn't a part of this organization, wasn't really a big name free agent signing. In fact, I'm pretty sure they signed him to a minor league deal, if I'm remembering right, and didn't make the team out of spring training. And he had the option to go elsewhere and look for another opportunity. And he chose to go to Reno, especially with what happened to Geraldo Perdomo a week into the season. That opened the door for Kevin Newman to come in. And he's really solidified himself, not just as the starting shortstop, but a really good defensive shortstop. He had an error today. I guess that's a little bit ironic, but he's been really solid at the shortstop position. And he's been one of their hotter hitters over the last couple of weeks. So that's an under-the-radar move by the Diamondbacks.
That's checking in on this iteration of the Diamondbacks with Steve Zinsmeister, who's part of the Diamondbacks radio broadcast team for them this season. It's time to go back, Steve, to late October of 2023, the World Series in Texas.
Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. See ebaymotors.com.
I won't let my moderate to severe plaque psoriasis symptoms define me.
Emerge as you. In 2 clinical studies, Tremfya guselkumab, taken by injection, provided 90% clear skin at 16 weeks in 7 out of 10 adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. In a study, nearly 7 out of 10 patients with 90% clear skin at 16 weeks were still clear at 5 years. At 1 year and thereafter, patients and healthcare providers knew that Tremfya was being used. This may have increased results. Results may vary.
Serious allergic reactions may occur. Tremfya may increase your risk of infections and lower your ability to fight them. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms of infection, including fever, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough. Tell your doctor if you had a vaccine or plan to.
Emerge as you. Learn more about Tremfya, including important safety information at tremfya.com or call 1-877-578-3527. See our ad in Food and Wine magazine. For patients prescribed Tremfya, cost support may be available.
You can live out your MasterChef dreams when you find a professional on Angie to tackle your dream kitchen remodel. Connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well. Visit Angie.com. You can do this when you Angie that.
So, just as a setting the stage kind of blanket statement, these teams did a lot of similar things last year to get to the World Series, the Fall Classic. Deadline moves. In particular, I think outside of Jordan Montgomery being acquired from the St. Louis Cardinals, the Rangers also grabbed Aroldis Chapman from the Kansas City Royals, and someone that I know that was a big deadline addition at that time for the Diamondbacks was also someone who was in the bullpen spot and eventually became the team's closer. Here's the other thing, Steve. I had to double check this because I couldn't remember. The Rangers and the Diamondbacks, believe it or not, played and won the exact same amount of games to get to the World Series. The Rangers swept the Rays in the opening wildcard round, both of those in Tampa. They swept the Orioles, 2 of those games in Baltimore in the divisional round. And then in the championship series, literally mirroring the Diamondbacks a full 7 games against the Astros, where the Rangers were unable to win a single game at home, but to their benefit of 4 games on the road, they were able to win it all and then meet the Diamondbacks in the World Series. Crazy how the 2 teams mirrored those paths to get there.
Yeah, and looking back on it, for me, at least from my perspective, you and I were doing post-game shows on the radio for covering the Diamondbacks. And when they asked us to do that together, my initial inkling was, all right, how long is this going to last? It could be 3 days, it could be a week, maybe. And, you end up doing 15 plus games. I think they ended up playing 17. I think we did at least 15 shows late into the night. And so, yeah, it was just as surprising on the Diamondbacks end as it was on the Rangers end. And when you talk about, making a big addition in the bullpen, you're referring to Paul Sewald, a guy who, was an established closer, something that this organization really hasn't had. They've had a lot of guys over the years who had experience at closing games, but maybe weren't in their prime. And Paul kind of solidified that for them. And he was able to give them a huge weapon going forward. And then, even more than that, they add a guy like Ryan Thompson, who they basically was kicked to the street by the Tampa Bay Rays, and they go and pluck him from obscurity. And all of a sudden he's your 7th inning guy and going multiple innings and throwing in any scenario that you might ask of him. And Kevin Ginkel just reached another level last year, particularly late in the season. And so there's your core right there. And right now, as it stands, I believe the statistic is in games where the 3 of them pitch, the Diamondbacks are 14-2. And that counts this season, which they haven't had a ton of opportunities because Sewald missed the first month and a half. But this team wins when those 3 guys pitch in any order. And that's clearly the lockdown back end of this bullpen right now. I talked to Paul the other day about, just being back and getting back into his comfort zone. He's still working on that, but the numbers are fantastic. His whip is like 0.52 since he came back. And then I asked Ryan Thompson today about having Paul back and what does that really do for a bullpen? And he said, not only is it a great guy and a great leader and a good player, but he said roles in a bullpen are important because the better idea you can give a reliever of when they're coming in, what they're going to be asked to do and who they're facing, the more information they have going in, the better they feel, the more confident they are, the better they are likely to perform. And so Ryan made it pretty clear to me today that having Paul back in the bullpen now after his injury, it makes all the difference because Ryan now knows he's coming in the game in the 6th or 7th inning. Ginkel knows he's going to get the 7th or 8th, usually following Thompson. Manaply is really the only guy right now that's being asked to do pretty much anything and everything. He's opened games like he did in LA last week. He's pitched the 9th when Ginkel got in some trouble. He's been asked to pitch 1 batter, lefty. So Manaply is kind of that Swiss Army knife right now, but it all comes back to Paul Sewald and that trade that they made last year that kind of catapulted them into the postseason, and their bullpen really was one of their strengths.
And of course, for the Rangers, Montgomery is no longer with the team. Aroldis Chapman signed with Pittsburgh, I believe, in the offseason. And it's kind of a theme of how that offseason went for the Rangers, but despite all that extra revenue, and despite the fact that they're coming off of a World Series title, there wasn't a lot of aggression in terms of trying to keep. They obviously kept the core together because most of the core was already under contract or they're rookies, but they didn't really aggressively try to keep a lot of those key pieces that helped them get there to keep pushing this next level. They signed some veteran contracts for David Robertson and Kirby Yates, who both of them have actually turned out really well for the Rangers so far. Their big pitching acquisition outside of that was Michael Lorenzen, which was another deal that came with just a week before the start of the season. And one of the biggest reasons that people point to is just the uncertainty with a TV contract that they, as far as right now, it's just going to be this season with Bally Sports, but then beyond that, nobody knows. And with all that uncertainty, it's just interesting to see how these two teams in particular that have dealt with similar financial strife, they've gone in the directions they have. But not too deep about that. Game 1, as we recall, as best we can anyway, a 6-5 final that Texas took in 11 innings. This was, I believe it was the first extra innings game of the postseason, of that postseason. And Steve, as we both know, there is no ghost runner, unfortunately, in postseason extra innings. So this one went late into the evening. The punctuation marks for me that I remember, of course, the Corey Seager home run in the bottom of the 9th inning to push it in the extras, and then Adolis Garcia walking it off in 11 innings. What stood out to you, whether from the Diamondback side or just from the game in general? What do you remember most about that?
Well, the important context that I remember is coming into the World Series, Adolis Garcia was widely considered the hottest hitter on the planet. So you knew, even going into game 1, the damage that he was likely to do at some point in the series. The fact that it happened so quickly was maybe something you would have liked to have avoided. But yeah, I mean, Corey Seager is arguably the biggest addition that franchise has made in a long time. And I mean, Marcus Simeon's probably got another claim to that as well. But I think really what that first game established was that your best players better be on their game when called upon, because Texas's will, because those guys were dominant from the get-go. And you kind of knew, like, okay, if they're at the top of their game, then Cattell needs to be at the top of his game. Corbin needs to be at the top of his game. Our starting pitching needs to be at the top of their the top level of what they can do. And so that's really what I felt in game 1. You don't feel out of it, certainly at that point. But what I remember feeling was, oh, yeah, we knew those guys could do those things. It's just now a matter of matching it on our end.
The Diamondbacks were able to even it up in game 2. What stuck out to me is probably similar to you. Merrill Kelly just absolutely dominating the Rangers offense that night. I mean, the only blemish was a Mitch Garver solo home run. But outside of that, Merrill made it feel like that the Diamondbacks were not a team to be messed with, despite all the success that the Rangers had in their postseason, despite having an extra close to 10 wins, I think, on them in the regular season. The Diamondbacks proved in that game, too, that they were not a team to be taken lightly, especially when they put up 9 on the Rangers that day.
Yeah, and I think for Merrill, really the entirety of the postseason went a long way to proving where he belonged in that conversation of really good starting pitchers, not just on the Diamondbacks, but in the National League. Because, you know, we all knew he was second best to Zach Gallen, and going into the postseason, we kind of all knew that there was a shortage of starting pitching for the Diamondbacks, at least last year's iteration of the team. And so Philadelphia in the NLCS was really the place where I think a lot of eyeballs nationally were on Merrill Kelly and how will he perform, and, you know, against that fan base in particular. And every environment he was thrown into, he stepped up and did more than asked. And I think that the world really started to see Merrill Kelly for what we already kind of knew he was able to accomplish. And that changed the series in a lot of ways. I know in hindsight, we know how the World Series ends and it's not great for the Diamondbacks, but I think that's probably the game where everyone in Texas realizes too, like, oh, okay, this is a pretty good Diamondbacks team, and they've got some dudes. So maybe this is going to be an interesting one.
And then the series shifts to Arizona. And you figure with two parks that are very well known for the high offensive output that it can provide to some of these hitters, you would think that we would see some similar output from the Rangers and from the Diamondbacks as well. But this was actually the lowest scoring game of the entire series. A 3-1 final in favor of Texas. And Steve, this one was kind of a blur for me because I couldn't really make out, well, what's there to remember about game 3? And then I instantly remembered. Max Scherzer and Adolis Garcia both got hurt in that game for Texas. And despite the Rangers getting the win, I don't know if you felt the same way. I personally felt like all the momentum at that point, when they announced the next day that Scherzer and Garcia were off the postseason roster, that all the momentum was going to shift towards Arizona in the series. I thought that for sure.
Yeah, I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't at least consider the fact that that might sway the series, and that, you know, you might be looking in the long run at a quote unquote tainted World Series win if you were to win. You know, I certainly wouldn't view it that way, but, you know, some people would look back and be like, well, their best player is out and their best pitcher is now out. So, you know, that's not legit. And so I had that concern initially, but it's also a double-edged sword. It's concern, but it's also, well, we might win this thing. You know, that might help you ultimately get to your end game goal. And that's certainly the big headline out of game 3. If I'm remembering right, that's Brandon Pfaadt's first start in the World Series, right? And yes. The significance of that is Brandon had been asked to pitch basically every major game in the postseason to that point. He had to pitch game 1 in Milwaukee because the Diamondbacks just kind of backed their way into the playoffs. And because of that, they blew Zach Gallen and Merrill Kelly in the last 2 games of the season. So Brandon, a rookie who did not do all that well, I think he'd be the first to tell you that, in the regular season, he ends up pitching game 1, the most important game of the season to that point, and obviously gets through that. He gets game 3 against the Dodgers when you're blowing the Dodgers out, and the playoffs finally come back to Chase Field for the first time in years. And so Brandon Pfaadt is the guy on the mound in front of the home crowd. There's some pressure that comes with that, you know, home or away. They both have their difficulties. There's things that are difficult about both, but he stepped up in that moment. And remember, he was dominating, and Torey Lovullo pulled him early and got a lot of boos for that. And, you know, and then he did it again against Philadelphia. He gets another home game in Philadelphia, and then he has to pitch game 7 against Philadelphia. So Brandon had kind of been building up this reputation of pitching the biggest games with the brightest lights. And so then you get to the World Series, and that's a pivotal moment for him, I would think, in his career, not just because it's a World Series game, but because he had already stepped up in some pivotal moments in the postseason run.
2 other people that made game 3 significant, at least for them individually. Marcus Semien hit his first home run in that game 3. That kind of woke him up, at least offensively. He would actually go on to be a big part of the remaining games of the series. And then John Gray, who probably at that point is best remembered for his explosion with the Rockies in the infamous 2017 wildcard game there at Chase Field. He, out of the bullpen behind Max Scherzer after Scherzer had to go early, was dominant and kind of in a way atoned for everything that had gone wrong in that prior outing, where he was the ace of that Colorado Rockies team, where in this situation, he was coming out of the pen, had struggled as a starter, but in that game, he essentially, at least in my opinion, atoned for everything that went wrong in that 17 wildcard game. The game 4, rather forgettable. I was rewatching some of this one, Steve. The Rangers put up 10 in the first 3 innings against what was the bullpen game for the Diamondbacks. And I'm sure even for you, that was the one that it was just, let's flush this and hope that they can come back with Zach Gallen in game 5.
Yeah, in some ways you want to just wipe it from your memory and forget about it. But I actually look back on that game kind of fondly in certain ways. That was, if I'm remembering right, the Joe Manaply opener, and Ryan Nelson came in and was spectacular for like 5 1/3, I think it was. And if I'm remembering right, I think he did give up 1 run maybe, or maybe it was scoreless. I can't remember, but he was clearly on his game. And that's a guy who had a rough season. They had relied on him to be their 5th starter in the rotation for, you know, like 95% of the season. They rolled with him all year long, even when he struggled. And they finally kind of threw him a bone in a game that had gotten away from them. And he comes in and he was dominant. And you start to second guess yourself a little bit like, oh crap, should we have pitched that guy to begin with? Like, should we have let him open this game? And, the opener strategy for the Diamondbacks, something that they're continuing to utilize here in 2024, at least against the Dodgers and probably against the Phillies when we see them soon. That's a strategy that doesn't necessarily, it's not a commentary on the starting pitcher and whether or not they're good. It's more of a commentary on the lineup that you're facing and how you feel you can best attack those first three hitters in a lineup, because it's the only time in the game where you can guarantee who you're facing in an inning. And so the Diamondbacks have utilized that strategy here again, twice against the Dodgers last week. And, they did it in front of Slade Ciccone and they did it in front of Ryan Nelson. And Ryan came out and had a spectacular outing against the Dodgers in relief, technically. And so I look back on that game 4 of the World Series, and it might not be the most memorable game or the sexiest box score that you can look back at. That was a big moment for Ryan Nelson in his career on an individual level. And I think that it went a long way towards him making the rotation out of spring training this year and developing as a pitcher. And if they're going to get something out of Ryan Nelson the rest of this season, I think a lot of it has to do with him stepping up in that moment.
And then lastly was game 5, where it was a really close game for the first 8 innings before the Rangers just kind of piled on in the top of the 9th inning. Zach Gallen literally did everything that he could to try and force that one back to DFW. And for whatever reason, that was the night that the Diamondbacks offense went quiet into the night. That was the night where Ketel Marte's postseason record hitting streak came to an end. And that was also the first time that the Rangers had ever hoisted the Commissioner's Trophy in their 50 plus year franchise history. There was a lot about that night that's obviously a lot to forget for the Diamondbacks, but for the Rangers, it was obviously a great moment in the franchise's long, long history.
Yeah, and specifically on Gallen, I mean, he had already built this reputation of really good pitcher on the road, excellent pitcher at home. And that kind of carried over into that postseason run and certainly into the World Series as well. So for me, my perspective on the Diamondbacks in that particular game is it solidified that for Zach, and I think showed the rest of the world that he's about as untouchable as there is when at home. And he's carried that over into 2024 as well. He had another start like that just the other day where he kept this team in the ball game for 7 innings straight. And if the bats don't wake up, you can't hold that against him. And so unfortunately, he's seen a bit of that over the last 6 to 8 months, whatever it's been. But that's what I'll remember. I obviously, anytime that a team wins the World Series and, won for the first time in a long time or first time in franchise history, as it were, that's huge. It's pivotal. It's everything. It's what these guys work for 365 days a year, and on the off days even, and on the days before spring training. And for Zach Gallen, the days immediately following the World Series, he's back to work to try to accomplish what the Texas Rangers ultimately accomplished against him. And that's what drives these guys. So it's games like Game 5 that motivate the Arizona Diamondbacks. And I think that they don't have a short memory when it comes to that kind of stuff. They're going to be able to recall what happened on that day and the feeling that they had in that clubhouse after the game. And that's going to motivate them and drive them, hopefully, when they try to accomplish the same goal this season.
Well, I remember us too, just speaking from our standpoint, enough about the game review, but that was a lot of, as you pointed out, we had done 17 games of that run, staying up late, taking people's phone calls that were talking after each and every win, after every loss, like that. It's nothing in comparison to the actual athletics that took place on the field, but it was still a lot of long nights for us. It was a lot of very difficult conversations that we had about guys in the lineup in particular that were not contributing at the level that you were expecting them to. And now I look back on it and I think, man, what a magical run that was, even though it didn't end, like from the Diamondbacks perspective, even though it didn't end with them hoisting up their second trophy. It was still one of the more miraculous runs that we've seen from a couple of teams in a Major League postseason in a while.
Well, and no matter how you slice it, it was the second greatest outcome in the team's history, right? I mean, they won the World Series in 2001, and then they made it to the World Series in 2023. There's nothing else, comes even close to that. And so when looking back on it, yeah, I'm with you. I'll remember, the long nights that you and I spent in the studio taking people's calls, and the things that I'll remember from that are, people
a lot of Chick-fil-A too.
A lot of Chick-fil-A. We did eat a lot of Chick-fil-A. That I regret that. But the thing that I'll remember most is getting calls from people who said, in 2001, I was a kid and my dad took me to what was Bank One Ballpark at the time for a World Series game. And now I get to take my kid to the World Series in 2023. And that's bittersweet, right? Because on the one hand, you're like, man, that's really awesome. And that's such a great feeling. And there's a whole new upbringing of Diamondbacks fans because of the World Series run last year. But on the other end of that is also the realization that it sometimes takes 20 plus years to get back to the big dance, so to speak. And so, that can be frustrating when you come to this realization that what you're looking to do, only 2 teams go to the World Series every year. And so only one team wins it. So that means 29 other teams lose. And it's just something that doesn't come around all that often. And even when you look at the grand scheme of like Arizona sports as a whole, how many championships have we even attended? The Cardinals went to the Super Bowl once in 2009. The Suns went to the finals in 2021. These things don't happen every year. And so you really had to attach yourself to it in the moment because you didn't want to let it slip by without you investing yourself as much as you possibly could into that. And I was thankful for the Diamondbacks giving us that opportunity to express our fandom in that way. And for us to be able to watch the team have that level of success, it's very rare in this game and something that you strive for, and rarely do you achieve it.
It was fun to look back, but now, of course, we have to look forward. So Monday will be an off day for both of these teams. Texas is traveling from Minnesota, making their way back to Globe Life Field, while the Diamondbacks just wrapped up a series against the Marlins in their home park, and they're making their way to the DFW now. And these teams will have this is the other thing that annoys me, Steve, just as we wrap up here. Only 2 games of these series. I thought we were done with this, just 2 games against an American League opponent. What happened?
Yeah, well, they found out one of them was going to be Brandon Pfaadt, and they said, we're good. We've seen enough of that guy. It's 2 games, and then the Diamondbacks get the New York Mets for 4. So I guess it all comes out in the wash for the D-backs. But I don't know. Usually, like in the NBA, you see like the teams who went to the NBA Finals, they play each other on Christmas, or they play each other on like the first game of the season.
Right.
So this is an interesting opportunity for the Diamondbacks and Rangers to come and meet each other because, like you kind of alluded to earlier, these teams are much different than they were at that point in October and into November last year. The Diamondbacks haven't really found their offensive identity at this point. Where we were screaming, embrace the chaos all of last fall, that really hasn't been as big of a factor for the Diamondbacks. They added a couple of big boppers like Jock Peterson and Eugenio Suarez, and they brought back Lourdes Gurriel, but the power hasn't really been there. Corbin Carroll is at a real deficit for power this season, counterbalances the fact that you bring in Jock, who doesn't play all the time. So this offense is struggling to find that identity at this point in the year. And they still have plenty of time to find it. It's just you'd rather do it sooner rather than later because as the Diamondbacks found out last year, when you get to the end of September, you got to be in the mix with those other teams that are in the mix for wild cards. And you got to have some of those, the qualifiers. You got to be able to top those guys in the event that you tie. And so right now the Diamondbacks are, technically they're not fighting for anything with the Texas Rangers, but they are fighting for something with, teams like the Padres or the Giants in their own division. Or you look at other divisions, and you look at like the Brewers or the Cubs or, any of those teams. And so this is an important series, not just because it's a fun rematch of the 2 teams that went to the World Series, but also too because it's a really important time for the Diamondbacks as they start to get some of those big players back. Like Perdomo is probably going to be back in the next week or two. Alec Thomas should be back hopefully right after that. And you'll start to see that identity of this team come to fruition.
He's Steve Zinsmeister. He's with the Diamondbacks radio broadcast team. And for the entire 2023 Diamondbacks postseason run, he was my cohort over at our family station, Arizona Sports. Steve, thanks so much for taking some time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mitchell. It's always lovely to speak with you.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Believe in Texas Rangers. We'll be back after the World Series rematch is done. So until then, believe in Texas Rangers.
I won't let my moderate to severe plaque psoriasis symptoms define me.
Emerge as you. In 2 clinical studies, Tremfya guselkumab, taken by injection, provided 90% clear skin at 16 weeks in 7 out of 10 adults with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis. In a study, nearly 7 out of 10 patients with 90% clearer skin at 16 weeks were still clear at 5 years. At 1 year and thereafter, patients and healthcare providers knew that Tremfya was being used. This may have increased results. Results may vary.
Serious allergic reactions may occur. Tremfya may increase your risk of infections and lower your ability to fight them. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms of infection, including fever, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough. Tell your doctor if you had a vaccine or plan to.
Emerge as you. Learn more about Tremfya, including important safety information at tremfya.com or call 1-877-578-3527. See our ad in Food and Wine magazine. For patients prescribed Tremfya, cost support may be available.
You can live out your MasterChef dreams when you find a professional on Angie to tackle your dream kitchen remodel. Connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well. Visit Angie.com. You can do this when you Angie that.